There are lots of ways of framing games. We can think of games as stories. We can think of them as challenge and frustration. I think it's important to be able to think of them in terms of pleasure and desire as well. Sometimes when I'm working on a game, I really think about what I'm doing is sculpting a player's sense of pleasure and desire. You're giving them short-term and medium and long-term goals. You're trying to give them challenges to overcome that are not too big and not too small. You're trying to give them something which is going to want them to keep on playing. Games can be very experimental. They can be very weird and unusual, but games are a little bit like cuisine, like cooking, in the sense that a chef can be very experimental. They can make the oyster look like a banana or whatever you want to do, but if it tastes like dirt, no one will eat it, right? I'm not saying that there's one good taste, but there's kind of a range, and you can go outside of it. You can make something so spicy that no one is going to eat it, right? Except for maybe a very, very, very tiny set of connoisseurs. And in general, even though you might have to do a lot of things with food and think about the cultural references that you're making and the aesthetics of the dining experience and the visuals of the plate, that, how it's presented, but it also has to taste good. And I think that games are similar. So there's always a component of what we do where we are playing with a player's sense of desire. And I actually think that, there's this interesting film, Jiro Dreams of Sushi. And he talks about how a chef has to cultivate their palate. And that, yes, you can learn technique, but you also have to have a palate that allows you to really differentiate the sort of subtleties of flavor. And I think that game designers need to cultivate their palate, which is really their own libido, their own sense of pleasure and desire. As you're playing your game and other games, you need to have your own sense of pleasure and frustration and challenge and excitement become like a dowsing rod for water, right? Like, how can you really be sensitive to when it's coming up, when it's coming down? Why and how are you feeling at all of those moments? I think that's a really important sense for game designers to cultivate. So yes, game designers, you could say, manipulate the player's pleasure, but to me, it's much less like a scientist with a lab coat and a checkbox doing some kind of behaviorist study, and it's much more like your own personal investigation of your own sense of pleasure and becoming sensitive to how it is that human beings feel things and observing your players and seeing all the things that's happening with them. And you're sort of in a dance with your players as you're developing a game and playtesting it, talking to them. Why do they feel this way? Why do they do that way? What would make them feel differently? What would give them a more narrow focused experience, or perhaps instead a richer, broader palette of experiences for them to have? So yes, pleasure is important, but for me, it's a very intensely personal part of the game. And again, you can study behaviorist psychology and use reinforcement schedules and where you drop resources in your game so players get them in a certain period of time. Those concepts can be useful, but if they're useful at certain moments, but at other times you may need to abandon them and work in a more intuitive and personal way.